It was supposed to be just a formal family gathering. But one small detail would reveal something far darker, a truth that had been buried for over a century. On a cold January morning in 2025, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood alone in her office at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. The air was still the kind that hums softly before revelation. Before her sat a parcel unmarked, unsigned, and unannounced. It had arrived 3 days earlier, wrapped carefully, but without a return address, with nothing inside except a single card that read, "This photograph has been hidden in my family for 150 years. It's time the truth was known." Sarah was used to receiving donations. As the museum's lead curator for 19th century social history, she handled relics of lives long gone, letters, journals, faded portraits. But this felt different. The frame alone was heavy carved mahogany, rich with the patterns of the 1870s. And as she peeled away the final layer of wrapping, something inside her shifted the faint prickle of unease that historians sometimes feel when the past begins to stare back. The photograph was large, mounted on thick cardboard, perfectly preserved despite its age. It captured a spacious interior, tall windows, spilling soft angled light across wooden floors, and an ornate carpet at the center. Furniture of quiet elegance framed the room, but it was not the setting that drew Sarah in. It was the people. 10 figures, 5 men standing, 5 women kneeling. The men were dressed in dark suits, crisp bow ties, patterned waistcoats. Their ages ranged from late 20s to mid-50s. They stood rigidly, the stiffness required by early photographic exposure, but their expressions cold, stern, deliberate spoke of hierarchy, of power. Before them, 5 women knelt on the carpet, positioned with almost ceremonial precision. Their dresses were plain, white, pale grey with high collars and long sleeves. Their hair was pulled back tightly, faces bowed, eyes hidden from view. Their hands rested quietly in their laps, folded or clasped in gestures that felt more like submission than formality. Sarah had seen thousands of photographs from the Victorian era. She knew the patterns, the etiquette, the postures of respect and class. But this composition felt wrong. The contrast between the men and women was too stark, too intentional. This wasn't a family portrait, it was a statement, one that made her skin crawl. She turned the photograph over. Faded brown ink scrawled across the back, read, "The Division, Whitfield Estate, Virginia, August 1870. The Division." The words sent a quiet chill through her. Immediately, she thought of inheritance settlements, the legal splitting of estates after death. But if this was such a moment, why were the women kneeling? What were they being divided, or who? And who had hidden the photograph all this time, guarding it as though it were a wound that could not be spoken aloud? Sarah placed the image under her examination lamp and leaned closer. Her instincts, sharpened by years of research, whispered that this was no ordinary artifact. There was a secret here, one wrapped in silence and shadow, deliberately concealed for 150 years. And now at last, someone had decided to let it surface. For the next several hours, she worked in silence. She photographed the piece from every angle recorded. Its frame, its print quality, the texture of its paper. Everything confirmed authenticity. This was the work of a skilled professional from the early 1870s. Then came the slow, meticulous study of the figures. She began with the men. The first on the left was older, perhaps early 50s, with streaks of grey in his beard, his posture confident, his suit perfectly tailored. A gold watch chain glinted faintly across his waistcoat, the quiet mark of wealth, of ownership, of someone accustomed to command. Sarah's eyes lingered on his expression, firm, composed, but behind it, something colder, something that history had a habit of overlooking. And somewhere deep within her, a question began to take shape. What was really being divided that day, in August 1870? Property or people? She did not yet have the answer, only the certainty that this photograph was more than a relic. It was a witness. And as the light in her office flickered against the polished glass, Sarah realized the past was not done speaking. It had simply been waiting for someone to listen. The second and third men appeared younger, perhaps in their 30s, their features similar enough to suggest blood, maybe brothers. The fourth man, late 20s, was clean-shaven, with sharp, confident lines to his face. The fifth, a little older, mid-40s, distinguished, almost noble, wore an expression that teetered between pride and something colder, almost contemptuous. Sarah studied them one by one, her magnifying glass trembling slightly in her hand. Beyond their expensive suits and tailored waistcoats, beyond the polish and posture they shared, something else, a sameness in stance that spoke of habit, of culture, of power, unquestioned. Feet placed firmly apart, one hand resting on a hip or slipped into a pocket, the other hanging loosely, sometimes holding a document or letter. Their gazes met the camera without hesitation, eyes hard, steady, commanding. Men who were used to being obeyed. Then Sarah's attention drifted downward to the women kneeling on the carpet before them. The examination grew harder now. Their bowed heads hid much of their faces, and the photograph's old emulsion blurred what time had already tried to erase. Yet as Sarah leaned closer, one quiet, horrifying pattern began to emerge, one that made her heartbeat falter. The first woman on the left appeared older, perhaps late 30s or early 40s. A thin streak of grey threaded through her tightly pulled back hair. Her dress was clean, but plain, made of coarse cotton or linen, not the rich silks that clothed the men. Her hands rested neatly in her lap. But the angle? Something about it felt wrong. Her wrists seemed too close together unnaturally, so as if drawn inward by invisible pressure. Bound, perhaps, Sarah swallowed hard and moved her magnifying glass to the second woman. Younger, maybe in her 20s, her dress was nearly identical in style, designed for labor, not leisure. Yet again her hands betrayed a quiet anomaly. They lay flat at her sides, but the fabric around her wrists was oddly bunched, uneven, as though something hidden beneath the sleeve distorted the drape. Sarah felt a coldness creep up her spine. And then, the third woman. She looked younger still, maybe a teenager. Her body language was different. Shoulders hunched, head lowered further than the rest, as though she were trying to disappear into herself. Fear seemed to seep from her posture. And there, at the edge of her sleeve, just visible where cloth met skin, Sarah saw a thin, dark line. Too precise to be a shadow, too circular to be a trick of light. Her breath caught. She turned to her computer, scanned the photograph at the highest resolution her equipment could handle. The image slowly appeared on the screen, grey tones sharpening into detail. Adjusting contrast, Increasing brightness, she zoomed closer and closer. The line was unmistakable now, not a shadow, not a flaw, a band. Something encircling the girl's wrist. Something metallic or leather tight and deliberate, half hidden beneath the sleeve. Sarah sat back, stunned. She knew she needed help. Someone who could see further into the layers of the image than her tools allowed. So she called Dr. James Park, an expert in forensic photography at Georgetown University. A man whose work had uncovered secrets from centuries-old images once thought silent. 2 days later, James arrived carrying a portable lab in sleek, black cases. Sarah showed him the photograph and her findings. James studied it in silence, his brow furrowing. After a long pause, he nodded. "I see what you're seeing," he murmured. "Let's set up the scanners. If restraints are hidden there, we'll find them." The process took hours. High-resolution digital capture, infrared imaging to see through layers of fabric, contrast analysis to expose faint shifts in texture invisible to the naked eye. Machine after machine hummed softly like mechanical heartbeats filling the quiet museum office. As each scan completed, James uploaded the files, refining, isolating, revealing. Time slipped away until his voice, low and tense, broke the silence. "Sarah, you need to see this." On his screen glowed the enhanced images, magnified fragments of wrists and hands. Sarah stepped closer, the reflection of the screen flickering in her eyes. The shapes were clear now, no longer guesses, no longer shadows. 5 women, 5 pairs of wrists, each one encircled by metal bands, thin, round, cold, hidden beneath their long sleeves. Iron. Shackles. Sarah stood frozen. The faint hum of the equipment filled the room, but all she could hear was the silence inside the photograph, the kind that carries echoes. This was not a portrait of family. It was documentation of ownership. And somewhere deep within that frozen August afternoon in 1870, the camera had caught something no one was ever meant to see. The images revealed something that made Sarah's stomach twist. The restraints weren't just symbolic, they were real. The shackles, now visible through James's enhancements, were connected by short lengths of chain. Short enough to let the women rest their hands in their laps or at their sides, but not enough to lift them freely. "Look here," James murmured, zooming in on the eldest woman's wrists. "You can see where the metal rubbed against the fabric from the inside. These marks, they're not new. These women wore the restraints for a long time, long enough for the cloth to bear their memory." He pointed again, this time to a faint discoloration on one woman's wrist. A pale scar, ring-shaped. The kind left by metal and time. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth. "All 5 of them." James nodded grimly. "All 5. He clicked to another set of scans. "But there's more. Look at their ankles." He enlarged the lower portion of the image, where the hems of the women's dresses brushed the carpet. Beneath the folds of fabric, faint but undeniable, were more circular outlines. Iron bands. The women weren't simply kneeling. They were shackled. At both wrists and ankles, arranged carefully, deliberately before the standing men, like property on display. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. The division The inscription on the back of the photograph, once cryptic, now felt like a blade turning in the dark. James finished the thought aloud, his tone low. This isn't a family gathering. It's property distribution. His eyes met hers. These women are being divided among the men. They were enslaved, and this photograph documents the inheritance of human lives. Sarah stared at the image, her mind spinning. August 1870. 5 years after the Civil War. 5 years after the 13th Amendment had declared slavery illegal. How she breathed. How could this exist in 1870? James frowned. Let's see what the background can tell us. Maybe there's something, a clue, a name. He began enhancing the walls, the furniture, every shadowed corner. After a long silence, he paused and leaned closer to the screen. There, he said softly, near one of the tall windows, a framed document hung on the wall. Using layered imaging and digital reconstruction, words began to emerge from the faded grain of the print. It's a property deed, James murmured. And look, the name Whitfield. That matches the inscription. And there's a date, 1868. Sarah's pulse quickened. Whitfield. The name that had slept in dust for over a century. That night, long after James had gone, Sarah began to dig. In archives, census records, old legal filings, anywhere that might hold the ghost of a name. And slowly, the story of the Whitfield estate began to take shape. A family of immense wealth. 3,000 acres of Virginia farmland. More than 200 enslaved people before the war. At its center, a patriarch, Thomas Whitfield, who died in 1869, leaving his vast holdings to his 5 sons. The very men, Sarah now believed, who stood in the photograph. His will had been executed in August 1870, the same date written on the back of the image. The estate had been valued at an enormous sum, its assets listed in cool legal language. Land, buildings, equipment, and other holdings. That phrase, polite bloodless, now felt like a whisper from the abyss. But what Sarah found next chilled her even further. Though the 13th Amendment had ended slavery on paper, the years that followed were a cruel illusion for many. Across the South, systems of debt, peonage, convict leasing, and forced labor had emerged, slavery reborn under new names. Virginia had resisted change more fiercely than most. Its so-called black codes stripped newly freed people of rights and movement. Plantation owners, men like the Whitfields, used legal tricks, fabricated debts and violence to bind them to the land they were told they'd left behind. Sarah found legal disputes, labor suits, debt claims, even criminal charges, all filed by the Whitfields in the late 1860s. Each case told the same story: formerly enslaved people who had tried to leave and were dragged back through paperwork and fear. Then she found it a complaint filed with the Freedmen's Bureau in 1869, filed by a group of women. They claimed they were being held against their will on the Whitfield estate, that Thomas Whitfield and his sons continued to keep them enslaved long after the law had changed. They spoke of threats, violence, and legal manipulation. The complaint was dated just months before Thomas's death, and the Bureau's official response, a single paragraph. An investigator had been sent to the estate. He reported no evidence of involuntary servitude. He stated that the women were legally employed under valid labor contracts. Sarah read that line again and again, her hands trembling. Contracts. 5 years after freedom. And still the chains remain, this time hidden beneath sleeves disguised by signatures and silence. She looked back at the photograph glowing on her monitor. 10 figures frozen in light. 5 men who inherited everything. 5 women who were never meant to be seen again. And somewhere beyond the paper and ink, a question echoed through time. When does history truly end? If its ghosts never stopped kneeling, the file had been closed. No arrests, no consequences. Just another paragraph buried in a century of silence. Sarah stared at the brittle pages, feeling her pulse throb in her ears. The language was cold, bureaucratic. But between the lines, she could read the truth. The Whitfields had been wealthy, powerful, connected. The investigator sent by the Freedmen's Bureau had likely been bought, or frightened, or simply unwilling to challenge one of Virginia's oldest names. And so the women who had dared to speak were left behind, trapped once more on the land they had tried to escape. Then came August 1870. Thomas Whitfield's estate was divided. His 5 sons inherited the land, the buildings, and it seemed the women. 5 heirs, 5 women. Each assigned, each claimed, each reduced again to property. Their chains hidden beneath layers of cloth and silence. The photograph captured that moment. A family portrait taken at the edge of freedom and proof that slavery's shadow had not vanished at all. Sarah leaned back from her desk, her throat tight. This wasn't just an image from the past. It was evidence, a record of a crime that had outlived its own legality. But one question now haunted her more than any other. Who were they? What were their names? What became of them after this photograph was taken? She knew the search would be nearly impossible. Records of the enslaved were fragmented, misspelled, or erased entirely. Most lived and died unnamed in ledgers that listed them by value, not by voice. Still, Sarah was determined. They deserve to be remembered, she whispered, not as shadows, as people. She returned to the 1869 complaint, the one filed to the Bureau. There, in fading ink, were 5 names. Rose about 40, Hannah 25, Patience 17, Ruth 30, Dina 28. 5 names, 5 women, 5 faces in the photograph. Sarah felt a tremor of certainty. These were them, the same women who had pleaded for freedom only a year before the image was taken. The same women who, despite law and proclamation, were still bound to the Whitfield estate. She began digging through archives and estate papers, collecting fragments, pieces of a broken story scattered across dusty records. Rose came first, the eldest. Born into slavery on the Whitfield estate around 1830. She had worked in the main house as a cook and domestic servant. The ledgers recorded her life in the cold language of commerce. 4 children born between 1848 and 1862. All 4 sold before their 10th birthdays. Sarah paused there, eyes stinging. The record listed no names for the children, only numbers, value in dollars, a silence deeper than grief. Hannah had been born around 1845 also on the estate. She had worked in the tobacco fields, the labor that made the Whitfields rich. An entry from 1868 mentioned her name beside a single word, insolent. In the language of the plantation, that word meant resistance, defiance, a refusal to be broken. Sarah didn't need to imagine what discipline followed such a charge. The archives were full of hints, the kind of punishments never written in full sentences. Then there was Patience the youngest, 17 in 1870. Born in 1853, the record naming her mother only as Mary. Mary's name vanished from the estate documents the following year, sold or dead. Patience had grown up within the house, working as a servant since childhood. By 1869, one document placed her in the household of Master Robert Whitfield, Thomas's second son. The same Robert who stood second from the left in the photograph. Sarah's breath caught. Patience hadn't been freed. She had been inherited. Ruth came next, about 30 years old. She had not been born on the estate. A bill of sale from 1858 listed her name and skills: fieldwork, cooking, washing, sewing. Sarah read the words again and again, each one a quiet act of erasure. A human life summarized as skills. Ruth had been bought from North Carolina, torn from family, brought to Virginia. Another life measured and traded. Finally, there was Dina, around 28. She appeared suddenly in the records in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War. No birth record, no family, only a notation acquired during wartime. Sarah suspected what that meant. Dina might have fled another plantation seeking freedom in the chaos, only to be captured and forced into service again. As the details accumulated, Sarah began to see them not as data points, but as lives that had refused to disappear. Rose's endurance, Hannah's defiance, Patience's youth, Ruth's skill, Dina's will to survive. The records tried to flatten them into inventory. But between the lines, Sarah could feel their humanity, quiet, persistent, unbroken. And one more name surfaced embossed faintly into the corner of the photograph itself. J. Morrison, a photographer, Richmond, Virginia, 1860s to 1870s. Known for portraits of the wealthy families in fine clothing, arranged with care before painted backdrops. Sarah stared at that elegant script, the faint signature of the man who had captured the image. Was he aware of what he was documenting? Did he understand that his lens had frozen, not a moment of inheritance, but an act of theft, one that outlasted the law itself? The deeper she looked, the clearer it became. The photograph was more than evidence. It was testimony, silent, undeniable, and waiting to be heard. The archives of the Virginia Historical Society were quiet, the kind of silence that hummed faintly with the weight of the past. Sarah sat surrounded by dust and paper, her gloved fingers turning the fragile pages of J. Morrison's records, appointment books, correspondence, fragments of a life spent behind a camera. Hours passed before she found the entry she was searching for. August 14th, 1870. Whitfield Estate Formal Commission Division Ceremony. Her breath caught. The note was brief, businesslike, and utterly damning. The photograph had not been a family portrait. It had been commissioned, arranged to commemorate the division of Thomas Whitfield's estate among his 5 sons. Then deeper in the file she found the letter. It was dated July 1870, written in the tidy hand of Charles Whitfield, the eldest son. We require a formal portrait to document the division of our father's estate among his 5 sons, he wrote. The photograph should show us in positions of authority and should include the 5 house servants assigned to our households as part of the settlement. They are to be positioned to reflect the proper hierarchy and their status as assets being divided. Sarah stared at the words, feeling her stomach twist. Assets, hierarchy, permanent record of inheritance. Each phrase stripped the humanity away, reducing lives to ledger lines. She turned to the next page. Morrison's reply was polite, professional, and chilling in its indifference. I will be pleased to accommodate your request. There was no hesitation, no moral concern, only the cold neutrality of commerce art, serving atrocity. But the most horrifying discovery came next. A contract dated August 1870, signed by the 5 Whitfield brothers. The same month, the photograph was taken. The document detailed the division of property, land, equipment, and servants. It listed the 5 women by name: Rose, Hannah, Patience, Ruth, and Dinah. Each woman, it said, was bound to serve faithfully for a term of not less than 20 years. They were to receive food and shelter, but no wages. They could not leave the estate without permission. They could not marry without consent. They were to obey every order without exception. And then came the final clause, the one that made Sarah's blood run cold. Should any servant attempt to leave before the completion of her term, or prove disobedient, she may be subject to correction and discipline as deemed appropriate by her assigned master, including, but not limited to, physical punishment, restriction of movement, and extension of service term. Sarah sat frozen, her hands trembling over the page. This was not employment. This was slavery, rewritten, disguised in legal language, and practiced openly 5 years after it had been abolished. The Whitfield sons had simply changed the vocabulary of bondage. They had replaced chains with contracts, overseers with signatures, and continued to enslave the same women beneath the cover of legality. And the world, the courts, the neighbors, the authorities had looked away. Sarah knew she couldn't stop here. She needed to know what had become of those 5 women after that photograph was taken. Did they survive those 20 years? Did any of them escape? Was there ever a moment when their voices were heard? She began the long, slow work of tracing their names through history, one record, one fragment at a time. Rose, the eldest, vanished first. After 1870, her name disappeared entirely. No burial record, no mention in any census. Only silence, the kind that history too often reserves for the women who bore its heaviest weight. Hannah appeared briefly in a court document from 1875, Hannah servant to William Whitfield. Then again in the 1880 census, still on the Whitfield property, listed as domestic servant. By 1890, her name too was gone. And then there was Patience, the youngest. The one whose bowed head had haunted Sarah since the first day she saw the photograph. Her name appeared again and again in estate ledgers and local documents through the 1870s and 1880s, always attached to Robert Whitfield's household. Then in 1887, something extraordinary. A court record, faint ink on yellowed paper, written in careful, untrained handwriting. I, Patience, have been held against my will by Robert Whitfield for 17 years. I am not bound by any lawful contract. I wish to leave his household and live freely. I have been denied wages for my labor. I ask the court to declare me free and to order Mr. Whitfield to pay me for my years of service." Sarah's hands shook as she read. After 17 years in silence, patience had spoken. She had taken her truth into the heart of the system that had sought to erase it. How had she found the courage? Who had helped her write those words? And most of all, had the court listened? The archives of the Virginia Historical Society held a faint trace of the story. Sarah had been following a partial collection of Morrison's business records, appointment books, and correspondence. One quiet morning, Sarah requested access to the records from 1870. She spent the entire day turning fragile pages, her fingers trembling slightly with each new discovery. And then she found it. In Morrison's appointment book for August 1870, there it was, a small, almost unnoticeable entry: Whitfield Estate, formal commission, division ceremony, August 14th. It was the confirmation she'd been searching for. The photograph had not been a family portrait at all. It had been commissioned to document the division of Thomas Whitfield's estate among his 5 sons. But it was a letter tucked neatly in Morrison's correspondence file that revealed the true darkness behind the image. Dated July 1870, it was from Charles Whitfield, the eldest son. His words were cold, efficient, and chillingly polite. "We require a formal portrait to document the division of our father's estate among his 5 sons. The photograph should show the 5 of us in positions of authority and should include the 5 house servants being assigned to our respective households. The servants should be positioned appropriately to reflect the proper hierarchy and their status as assets being divided." Sarah read the letter slowly, her breath catching as she reached the final line. "This portrait will serve as a permanent record of rightful inheritance. Human lives described as assets, women described as possessions." She could almost feel the quiet rage rising inside her. Morrison's reply was professional, detached, and soulless. He would be pleased to accommodate the Whitfields' requirements and would arrange the session at their convenience. Not a single word of hesitation. No sign of conscience. Then Sarah uncovered a document that made her blood run cold, a contract, dated August 1870. It formalized the division of Thomas Whitfield's estate, listing not only land and property, but also the names of 5 women: Rose Hannah Patience, Ruth, and Dinah. The terms were horrifying. Each woman was bound to serve her assigned master for no less than 20 years. They would receive food and shelter, but no wages. They were forbidden to leave, forbidden to marry, and required to obey every command. And then, one clause stood out like a wound on the page. Should any servant attempt to leave before the completion of her term or prove disobedient, she may be subject to correction as deemed appropriate by her master, including physical punishment, restriction of movement, or extension of service. Sarah sat frozen. 5 years after the end of slavery, the Whitfield sons had simply renamed it slavery disguised as service. Contracts forged, authorities complicit, and 5 women trapped in bondage that the law refused to see. Sarah knew what she had to do. She needed to find out what happened to those women after that photograph was taken. Were they trapped there for the 20 years written in that cruel contract? Did any of them ever escape? Or did history simply forget them? like so many others. The search was painstaking. She combed through census records, property files, court ledgers, and old newspapers from the 1870s and 1880s, chasing faint echoes through time. Rose, the eldest, disappeared first. No record after 1870. Perhaps she had died within those walls, unseen, unnamed. Hannah appeared a few times, listed in 1875 as servant to William Whitfield. Then again in the 1880 census, still on the same property. After that, silence. But it was Patience, the youngest, whose story refused to fade. Sarah found traces of her in document after document, always tied to Robert Whitfield's household. And then, in 1887, a spark of defiance appeared in ink, a complaint filed in circuit court, written by Patience herself. I, Patience, have been held against my will by Robert Whitfield for 17 years. I am not bound by any legal contract and wish to leave his household. I have been denied my freedom and my wages. I ask the court to declare me free and to order Mr. Whitfield to pay me for my years of service. Sarah's hands trembled. In that simple, careful handwriting lay an act of extraordinary courage. A woman once enslaved, standing before the law and demanding freedom. But history, as always, was cruel. Robert Whitfield responded by producing the so-called contract, insisting that Patience was legally bound. The case went before a judge in November 1887. Sarah found the ruling, and her heart sank. The judge sided with Whitfield. He wrote that the contract appears legally binding, and that no evidence of involuntary servitude existed. It was a mockery of justice. Patience's plea had been ignored, her voice dismissed, but the story did not end there. In early 1888, Robert filed a report claiming that his servant Patience had absconded from his property and offered a $10 reward for her return. And then, nothing. No more records, no trace, which could only mean one thing. Patience had escaped. She had vanished into the night, into the network of black communities across Virginia, and perhaps into freedom. Months later, Sarah began searching for living descendants, people who might hold the missing pieces, the memories, the truth. It took time. Letters, emails, phone calls. Until one day, an email arrived from Jennifer Washington, a librarian in Philadelphia. Her words were gentle, certain. My grandmother told stories about her ancestor Patience, who escaped from a plantation in Virginia around 1888. She made it to Philadelphia married and lived until 1920. My grandmother knew her personally. Sarah could barely breathe. The Patience she had read about in court documents had lived. Jennifer shared her family's story, how Patience had traveled north under the cover of darkness, helped by black families along the way. How she had built a new life in Philadelphia, working as a seamstress, marrying a man named Samuel Washington, and raising 3 children. She never went back to Virginia, Jennifer said softly. She was too afraid. But she made sure all her children could read and write. One became a teacher, one a nurse, and one, my great-grandmother, owned a business. Jennifer even had something else, a memoir. A few pages written by Patience herself late in life. Sarah read it with tears in her eyes. They made us kneel before them while the photographer took our picture. We wore chains beneath our dresses so we could not run. They wanted a picture to show we belonged to them. I swore that day I would not belong to anyone forever. Patience wrote of her escape, how she had waited, saved small coins, and when the time was right, walked away. I was 35 years old when I finally became truly free. I had spent my life under the control of others. When I realized no one was coming after me, I wept for hours, but they were tears of joy. For 6 long months, Sarah prepared the exhibition, the Whitfield photograph at its heart. Not as a portrait of inheritance, but as a record of survival, a quiet testament to a woman who refused to remain a name in someone else's ledger. And as she looked at that photograph one last time, Sarah whispered, "You made it, Patience. You kept your vow." Rewritten script, sleepy history tales, style. The exhibition opened quietly on an early September morning in 2025. Its title was Simple Haunting: The Division How Slavery Continued After Abolition. Inside the National Museum of American History, the air felt heavy with anticipation. Visitors spoke in hushed tones as if they were entering a sacred space. At the center of the gallery stood the photograph, the same one that had haunted Sarah for years. Now it was framed in glass and light. Beside it, screens flickered softly, showing the enhanced images, the faint, unmistakable outlines of shackles beneath the women's clothing. The truth once hidden for 150 years was now revealed. All around the room, panels told the broader story: the failure of Reconstruction, the false promises of the 13th Amendment, and the countless ways in which forced labor endured under new names, debt contract servitude. Sarah and her colleague James Park had spent months designing a multimedia display. Visitors could watch as the digital analysis peeled back the layers of the photograph, transforming it from an image of quiet composure to a revelation of control of suffering. Along the gallery walls, the story of the 5 women unfolded: Rose, Hannah, Patience, Ruth, and Dina. Each had her own panel, her own name, her own story. No longer anonymous, no longer forgotten. And among the crowd on opening night stood Jennifer Washington, a quiet woman with kind eyes and trembling hands. She was joined by her family, all descendants of Patience. They stood together before the image of their ancestor, a woman forced to kneel in chains, while strangers around them learned of her courage, her escape, and her freedom. More than 800 people came that night: historians, civil rights leaders, journalists, students, and descendants of the enslaved. The exhibition filled every corner of the news the next morning, and at the heart of every article was that photograph, a symbol of the truth that history had long refused to see. Dr. Marcus Williams, a historian of Reconstruction, spoke first at the ceremony. His voice carried across the hall, calm but heavy. This photograph reminds us that abolition did not end slavery overnight. For years, even decades after emancipation, many remained enslaved in all but name. They were trapped by contracts, by debt, by fear. These 5 women were legally free, yet bound by lies and power. This photograph is their testimony. Then Sarah stepped forward. Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of truth. When I first saw this photograph, she said, I sensed something was wrong, something hidden beneath the surface. The technology allowed us to see the literal chains beneath the clothing. But the deeper research revealed the invisible ones, The legal manipulation, the corruption, the silence that kept these women bound. They were trapped not just by metal, but by the willful blindness of an entire society. Finally, Jennifer spoke. She stood beside the photograph, tears catching the light. "This is my great-great-grandmother Patience," she said softly. "I feel sadness for what she endured, the years stolen from her. But I also feel pride. Pride that she escaped, that she built a life of freedom, that she raised children who carried her strength forward. She refused to let her oppressors define her. She refused to remain silent." The crowd was still. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply stared at the photograph as though seeing it for the first time, not as an image of submission but as proof of survival. The exhibition remained open for 18 months. More than 200,000 people walked through those doors, and each one left changed, carrying a quiet understanding that the story of freedom had never been simple. The photograph became iconic, reprinted in textbooks, discussed in classrooms, shown in documentaries. But its greatest legacy was not in museums or news headlines. It lived in the voices of those who came forward. Families who had long hidden their own stories of bondage after emancipation. Some brought yellowed letters, worn photographs, and whispered memories passed down through generations. Others brought only words, the need to be heard, to be remembered. With their help, Sarah began building something larger, a database, a living record of every story she could find. A place where names could be preserved, where history could no longer be erased by silence. The Whitfield estate itself became the focus of new attention. Once private, it was now owned by a preservation group. After Sarah's research became public, they announced something remarkable. The property would be transformed into a memorial site. "We cannot change what happened here," the director said, "but we can tell the truth. We can honor the women who suffered here and ensure that their names are never forgotten again." The museum also created the 5 Women Memorial Fund, offering scholarships for descendants of the enslaved and supporting research into African American history. Jennifer and other descendants worked closely with the museum to make sure the fund reflected the strength, courage, and dignity of their ancestors. A year later, Sarah returned to the exhibition on a quiet afternoon. A teacher was guiding a group of high school students through the gallery. They stood before the photograph, their voices hushed, their faces thoughtful. "Look," the teacher said. "See how the photographer composed this image, the men standing above the women, kneeling below. This was not a family portrait. It was a performance of power." One student raised her hand. "But slavery was over then." "Right." The teacher smiled sadly. "Yes, legally. But as this photograph shows, the law doesn't always end in justice. These women were free in name, but bound by fear, by deception, and by the silence of those who refused to help them." Another student asked quietly, "Did any of them ever escape?" The teacher pointed to the panel about Patience. "She did. She ran in 1888 and built a new life in Philadelphia. Her descendants are still alive today. Her freedom became their legacy." Sarah watched them, the students, studying the faces of women who had been hidden for generations. They leaned closer to the enhanced image, seeing the faint outline of iron around a wrist, the quiet defiance in a woman's eyes. This was why the work mattered, not just to uncover the past, but to teach the living to see what history had tried to hide. As the students moved on, Sarah lingered before the photograph. She thought again of the anonymous donor, the person who had sent the image to her years ago, without a name, without explanation. Whoever they were, Sarah knew their reason. After 150 years, it was time for the truth to surface. The photograph had once been created to display control, a record of domination, of ownership, of cruelty. But now it stood for something entirely different. It had become a memorial to 5 women who were never meant to be remembered. 5 women whose names were now spoken aloud. Rose, Hannah, Patience, Ruth, Dina. They had been forced to kneel so that others could feel powerful. But now the world stood before them. Sarah closed her eyes and whispered softly, as if speaking to ghosts still lingering in the frame. You are seen now. You are remembered. This is your freedom.